Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar this afternoon. It's currently 1 p.m. Eastern, and we're just going to give people a couple of more minutes to join us. So we'll get started at 5 past the hour. So I'm just going to mute myself for a couple of minutes, and I'll be back on air at 5 past the hour, and we'll get started with the webinar. Thank you. So we're waiting until everybody joins us that has registered, and we'll get started at 5 past the hour. So we're going to get started this afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Saneet. I am a trainer with the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program, and I will be your host for the webinar this afternoon. Because of COVID-19 and self-isolation measures, I am working from home. So I apologize in advance if you do hear any background noise. If you hear a dog barking, I do apologize. That is my dog, and she can be very vocal at times. She's currently dreaming at the moment, and she does have some very intense dreams. So if you hear any whining or barking or dog noises in the background, I do apologize. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide an update on measures introduced by IRCC, UNHCR, and the IOM in response to COVID-19, and look at what impact those measures have had and are having on refugee sponsorship and resettlement to Canada. We did one of these webinars around 2 weeks ago when the measures were first introduced, such as the travel restrictions and the subsequent measures that were introduced by IRCC, UNHCR, and the IOM. We did a webinar on April 18th, and the week commencing April 16th. And this is a follow-up webinar to that because some things have changed since that webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago, but in many ways some things haven't changed and things almost remain the same. So we'll be providing an update to those measures that were introduced by the various actors and organizations involved in refugee sponsorship and resettlement to Canada. And then we'll be opening the floor up to Q&A because I understand a lot of you may have questions about applications that you've submitted, applications that may be on hold at the moment because of COVID-19, as well as applications for refugees that were finalized, approved by IRCC and were travel ready to come to Canada. So we'll be having an extensive Q&A session because the substantive content part of this webinar is just going to be a very quick and brief update because, like I said, not much has changed since the last update webinar we did around 2 weeks ago. There are a couple of handouts that are available to download, and hopefully you're able to see them on your webinar control panel. One of the handouts is a Key in Canada contacts handout for IRCC, and that handout outlines the contact information and responsibilities of the in Canada IRCC departments that are responsible for refugee sponsorship and resettlement to Canada. So you'll have the contact details of the Resettlement Operations Centre in Ottawa. You'll have the emailing address of the office, and in the Resettlement Operations Centre in Ottawa is the central intake point for all refugee sponsorship applications or privately sponsored refugee sponsorship applications. And there's also the contact details of the Resettlement Services Assurance Team in that handout. And the Resettlement Services Assurance Team is responsible for all of the post-arrival issues that may arise in refugee sponsorship, including following up with sponsors and sponsored newcomers to ensure that they are providing adequate support as well as receiving adequate support. And we'll be making reference to both the Resettlement Operations Centre in Ottawa, as well as the Resettlement Services Assurance Team throughout this webinar, which is why it may be handy for you to have their contact details available in the handout, just so that you're not writing down their email address on screen when I have it up. You're able to just go to the handout, download it, and copy and paste their email address into your email if you do need to contact them. There's also two other handouts, and they are handouts in English and French that compile multi-language resources on COVID-19. And there's links to resources produced by international, national, and provincial organizations that have information in a number of different languages, and the languages most commonly spoken by sponsored newcomers that do come to Canada, on the symptoms of COVID-19, how to prevent its spread, how to ensure that you're physically distancing, and that all the links in those resources may be helpful for those of you that have already had sponsored refugees already arrive in Canada, as well as those of you that have applied to sponsor refugees that are still overseas and you want to share some information with them on COVID-19 just to ensure that they are able to take precautions to ensure that they're safe, they are practicing physical distancing, and they are aware of the prevention and treatment of the virus. So there's a couple of comments coming in from a couple of people saying that they can't hear me. So if you are having issues hearing me at the moment, please let me know and I will try and fix the audio issues. If you are able to hear me okay, please also let me know using the question box, just so I know whether it's somebody that, or whether certain individuals are having issues, or whether it's an issue on my end with the system. Okay, so it seems most of you are able to hear me, so thank you for letting me know. Those of you that are having issues with hearing me, what I would ask you to do is if you're able to issues. telephone, it appears that there was an issue on my end. So please let me know whether you can hear me now. Okay, good. So thank you for letting me know. People are able to hear me now. So I apologize for the issues. It seems like there was a combination of issues on my end as well as on everybody else's end. So hopefully those of you who were having issues hearing me are able to hear me now. Again, if there are any issues as we go along, please do let me know and we'll hopefully be able to fix those on if and when they do come up, but hopefully we have no more audio issues. So again, I do apologize. So getting back to the webinar, the purpose of today's webinar is to provide an update on measures introduced by IRCC, UNHCR, and the IOM in response to COVID-19, and the impact those measures have had on refugee sponsorship and resettlement to Canada. And as I was explaining, there are a couple of handouts available to download. There is one handout that provides the contact details of IRCC's departments and in Canada that are responsible and involved in refugee sponsorship and resettlement. So you'll be able to find the contact details of the Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa, as well as the Resettlement Services Assurance Team. And what you will also be able to see in the handouts list is there are 2 resources on COVID-19 that compiles multi-language resources that have been produced by various international, national, and provincial agencies. And you can share these resources with sponsored refugees that have already arrived in Canada, as well as refugees that you may be sponsoring that are abroad. So in terms of the agenda for today, we're going to provide an overview of the webinar control panel, and then we're going to go straight into the updates on measures that have been introduced by IRCC, UNHCR, and the IOM in response to COVID-19. And then we will briefly look at the available resources, and then we'll just provide you with some information on how you can stay up to date on all of these measures, and then we'll open the floor up to Q&A. Okay, so a couple still telling me you can't hear me. Okay, so a couple of you were letting me know that you're not able to hear me. Are you able to hear me now? Okay, so I won't use a microphone or a headset. It appears that the issue is with the headset. So thank you everybody for letting me know that you're able to hear me. So in terms of the agenda for today, we're going to provide an overview of the webinar control panel, and then we'll get started on the updates to measures that have been introduced by IRCC, UNHCR, and the IOM. Brief overview of the available resources that are out there on COVID-19, some information on how to stay up to date, and then we'll go into Q&A. So this is the webinar control panel, and hopefully you're able to see it somewhere on your screen. And this is the control panel that you can use throughout the course of this webinar to let me know whether you're experiencing any audio issues, if you're having difficulties with seeing the presentation. Also, if you have any questions, you're able to enter them into the question box, and I'll be going through them when we come to the Q&A part of the webinar and addressing your questions. And if you have a microphone attached to your computer along with voice over IP functionality, you can raise your hand using the raise your hand button, And when we come to the Q&A part of the webinar, I'll be able to unmute you and you can ask your question in person. And then also somewhere on the control panel will be the handouts that are available to download. Okay, so we're going to get started with the update of measures that have been introduced. Most of these will be a recap or a reminder for those of you that did attend our previous update webinar. And again, we're going to give you the same caveat that these are the measures and policies that are in effect as of today. Things are changing very quickly in relation to COVID-19. So if you are going back and reviewing a recording of this webinar at a later date, some of these measures may have changed or they may have been updated. So the measures we are going to look into and discuss are the ones that are currently in effect as of today. And as I mentioned earlier, not much has changed since the previous update webinar that we did around 2 weeks ago. So for most of you, this will be an update. For those of you that did not attend that webinar, this will be new information. So as we all know, the Prime Minister of Canada announced travel restrictions on March 16th, 2020, that came into effect on March 18th, 2020. And these measures were introduced in order to stem the spread of COVID-19 in Canada. The travel restrictions continue to be in effect as of today, and Canada is currently denying boarding to all foreign nationals on flights coming to Canada from all countries, unless they fall within one of the identified exemption categories. Refugees sponsored to Canada under the private sponsorship of Refugees program, the Government Assisted Refugees program, the Blended Visa Office Referred program, and the Joint Assistance Sponsorship programs do not become permanent residents until they arrive in Canada at a port of entry. And because of this, they are affected by these travel restrictions. IRCC and the International Organization for Migration have cancelled all planned arrivals for sponsored refugees beyond March 18th, 2020, and that includes April 2020. So all planned arrivals that were scheduled after the travel restrictions came into effect on March 18th, 2020 have been cancelled until further notice, and there is no information on when regular travel to Canada may resume. If you received a notification of arrival transmission, or a NAT, for an arrival scheduled after the travel restrictions came into effect on March 18th, 2020, your group, as well as the refugees that you're sponsoring, should have already received a cancellation notice for that notification of arrival transmission. In terms of the operations of UNHCR and the IOM, their operations are affected by COVID-19, and their capacity has been reduced as a result of the virus. And on March 17th, 2020, UNHCR and the IOM announced that they are temporarily suspending resettlement travel for refugees to all countries in order to reduce the risk of refugees being exposed to the virus. Now, before the travel restrictions came into effect on March 18th, 2020, there were a number of refugees that were already traveling to Canada and were in transit to Canada. And those refugees that did not arrive in Canada before the travel restrictions came into effect received assistance from the IOM and UNHCR to return to their original point of departure. So if there were refugees that you were sponsoring who were in transit to Canada before the travel restrictions came into effect, they should have received assistance to return to their original point of departure. They may not have been able to return to their original point of departure depending on the situation they were in prior to departure and what the situation is like in that area or the country that they were located in before they left. But all refugees that were in transit have been provided assistance and should have been returned to their original point of departure. if you are sponsoring a refugee or a refugee family that was in transit to Canada, i.e. they were traveling to Canada before the travel restrictions came into effect and they weren't able to arrive in Canada before those restrictions did come into effect, and they're still stuck in transit, please advise the refugees to contact their local IOM or UNHCR office, or you as sponsors can contact the Resettlement Operations Centre in Ottawa via email if the refugees are unable to contact their local IOM or UNHCR office. One of the identified exemption categories for the travel restrictions are persons with permanent resident visas that were issued before the travel restrictions came into effect. And currently there's around 7,500 sponsored refugees that were in possession of permanent resident visas before the travel restrictions came into effect. Around 3,900 of those were government-assisted refugees, and 3,600 of those were privately sponsored refugees. So theoretically, those refugees that are in possession of a permanent resident visa could travel to Canada because they are one of the exemptions to the travel restrictions. However, there continue to be extremely limited travel routes and flights to Canada to facilitate the travel of those refugees with permanent resident visas. And both the IOM and IRCC have no capacity at this time to issue travel documents that the refugees need for them to travel to Canada. Refugees with permanent resident visas are discouraged from self-booking travel to Canada, even if they are able to self-book a flight, given the restrictions that most airlines have introduced. But if they are able to self-book travel to Canada, they are discouraged from doing so, as the IRCC and the IOM are not able to issue travel documents that the refugees need in order for them to come to Canada, and the IOM doesn't have the capacity to provide assistance to the refugees if there are any difficulties or issues while they are traveling to Canada. Because it is an evolving situation, countries' borders are closing and reopening for certain periods of time, and if there are any travel issues with refugees that do self-book, who do have a permanent resident visa to come to Canada, then the IOM will not be able to provide them with any assistance. In addition, those refugees that do self-book may experience complications regarding their transportation loan, because if they've already been issued their transportation loan and they decide to self-book travel to Canada, there may be issues informing IRCC and the IOM in order to ensure that they don't have to repay that transportation loan, given that they self-booked travel. So because of all of these issues, IRCC has discouraged refugees, or IRCC does not encourage refugees that do have a permanent resident visa to self-book their own travel to Canada. What IRCC have said is that as travel routes reopen and become available, IRCC will be contacting sponsored refugees to confirm their willingness to travel to Canada. And these are the refugees that are in possession of a permanent resident visa and are exempted from the travel restrictions. And IRCC will also contact the sponsors to confirm their readiness to receive the newcomers, who will need to self-isolate for 14 days on arrival, as well as to confirm the sponsor's capacity and ability to provide financial and settlement support on arrival. And IRCC will contact sponsors via email if and when travel is possible for sponsored refugees in possession of a permanent resident visa, and sponsors or the refugees should not contact IRCC because they are trying to figure out whether this is possible, how they can make this happen. They will contact you if you have sponsored a refugee that is in possession of a permanent resident visa, or that was in possession of a permanent resident visa before the travel restrictions came into effect. They will contact you. Please do not contact IRCC. The only exception to that rule is if you have an extremely urgent case. So if you have an extremely urgent case, let's say somebody is at risk of being deported by the country of asylum back to their home country, then you would contact IRCC to let them know about this urgent case. But even once you've informed IRCC, they still won't be able to arrange travel for those urgent cases until the travel routes and the flights reopen. So if and when IRCC is able to arrange travel for refugees in possession of a permanent resident visa, they will contact the sponsors as well as the refugees in order to confirm that the refugees would like to travel and that the sponsors have the capacity to facilitate arrival as well as provide financial and settlement support to the refugees on arrival. Please do not contact IRCC. They will contact you unless it is an extremely urgent case. In terms of application processing, so the Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa, the office that they're based at, the physical office, remains closed, but officers from Morocco are teleworking off-site and they are processing cases remotely. Morocco continues to process applications they receive by email, but they currently don't have the ability to process applications that are submitted via mail, as they are not in the office to physically receive the applications that are coming in via mail. So if you do want to submit a new refugee sponsorship application, you should only submit your applications via email so they can be processed. And I'll show you when we come to the resources section of this webinar where you can find a recording of a webinar that shows you how to prepare an application package for email submission. For those of you that have already submitted applications to Rocco via mail, in order to avoid duplication, Rocco have advised that applications already submitted by mail should not be resubmitted via email. The mailed applications will be processed in the order they are received when Rocco resumes normal operations. So that's very important. If you've already submitted your application via mail to Rocco, please do not resubmit it via email. It will be processed when Rocco resumes normal operations. And another important thing to remember about application processing is that apart from certain exemptions introduced for one-year window applications, Rocco have not announced any other exemptions from the regular application requirements for privately sponsored refugee applications. So new privately sponsored refugee applications submitted by sponsorship agreement holders, as well as their CGs and co-sponsors, groups of 5 and community sponsors, must be complete, and all of the requirements must be met in order for them to be processed. Otherwise, they will be returned or refused. And we'll look at those exemptions that have been introduced for one-year window applications on the next slide. But if you are submitting a new refugee sponsorship application to Rocco, please ensure you have all of the supporting documents and all of the required forms before you submit the application, because they will not process incomplete applications. They have not introduced any exemptions from the regular processing requirements, apart from those that have been introduced for one-year window applications. When it comes to application processing overseas, the Canadian migration offices overseas, some of them remain closed, while others have reduced their capacity and are only engaging in critical operations. And when we say critical operations, what we mean is that they're only providing consular assistance to Canadian citizens and permanent residents. And because of the reduced capacity of Rocco, as well as migration officers overseas, there will be delays to processing in Canada as well as overseas, and IRCC are unable to provide specific information on processing times because of the evolving nature of the situation. When it comes to the Blended Visa Office Referred program, there is no new matching of refugee profiles happening at this time. Those that have already been matched with a profile under the Blended Visa Office Referred program, you will have your applications processed and they will remain in the processing queue. Obviously, with the travel restrictions, they will most likely not arrive for some time. In relation to the transportation loan, IRCC has suspended its transportation loan collection activities for a period of 6 months until September 2020. and all of those with loans will be notified that payments are being suspended until September 2020. However, if the refugees that you've sponsored who are now repaying their loans because they're out of the sponsorship period, if they have authorized automatic payments, the newcomers will need to contact ISCC's collection services to cancel those automatic payments. And I'll show you where you can get the contact details of ISCC's collection services so the newcomers can contact them in order to cancel those automatic pre-authorized payments. And if the newcomers would still like to continue paying their loan or make alternative arrangements, then they should also contact ISCC's collection services, and I'll show you how to do so in a moment. When it comes to one-year window application, so if you remember a couple of minutes ago, I mentioned that there have been some exemptions introduced for application processing of one-year window applications. And what ISCC have said is that if there is a risk of the one-year window expiring because applicants are not able to get all of the necessary forms and documentation together in order to submit that one-year window application within that one-year period after the newcomers arrive in Canada, the one-year window application should be submitted at whatever the state the application is in to ROCCO, just so they don't miss that one-year deadline. And ROCCO will place the application to the side, and when the sponsors or the newcomers are able to get all of the required forms and documentation, they can then add them to the file, submit them to ROCCO, and then ROCCO will resume normal processing. So if you do need to submit a one-year window application, or the refugees you're sponsoring need to submit a one-year window application rather, and they're having difficulties with getting forms signed, they're having issues with getting documents together, then just submit the application in whatever state it is in, and ROCCO will accept the application, they'll hold it, and then when you're able to provide the documents and the forms that were missing, they will just add it to the application and then start processing it. But it's very important that you do not miss that one-year deadline. And as a reminder, once sponsored refugees arrive in Canada, if there were non-accompanying family members listed on the application package, the sponsored newcomers have 1 year after their date of arrival to submit the one-year window application. So if you do have refugees that you've sponsored that are within their sponsorship period, please do make sure that they do submit the one-year window application as soon as possible so they do not miss that 1 year deadline. In terms of sponsors being able to provide financial and settlement support to refugees that have already arrived in Canada, please do try to explore alternative ways of providing financial and settlement support to refugees that may have already arrived in Canada and that are still within their sponsorship period. So, for example, if you are providing financial support, you should still be able to provide financial support while maintaining physical distancing to the refugees via e-transfers. So you don't necessarily need to provide that via check. If you are able to set up e-transfers from your computer or your phone with your bank, you're able to transfer the monthly income support to the refugees on a monthly basis while maintaining physical distance. In terms of being able to provide settlement support, you can explore video call options via Skype, WhatsApp, Facebook, as well as Viber, because some refugees, they may not be comfortable with using a computer, or they may not have access to a computer, but they may have access to a smartphone. And Skype, WhatsApp, Facebook, and Viber video calls can be done via a smartphone as well as a computer. If the refugees do have access to a computer, you may want to look into Zoom or Skype meetings. But if you as sponsors, if you've had sponsored refugees arrive in Canada that are still within their sponsorship period, if you have any concerns about your ability to provide financial or settlement support in light of COVID-19 and the physical distancing that we're all observing, please do contact ISCC's Resettlement Services Assurance Team, and their email address is available on screen, but it's also available in the Key in Canada contacts handout that's available to download via the webinar control panel. So that's a quick recap on all of the measures that have been introduced by IRCC, UNHCR, and the IOM, and the impact that they're having on refugee sponsorship and resettlement to Canada. Very briefly, before we open up the floor to Q&A, I'm just going to show you some helpful resources that you may find useful. So hopefully everybody is able to see my screen. So the first resource that we'd like to draw your attention to is the World Health Organization's website. They have a COVID-19 hub, and the information in this hub is available in English, French, Russian, Spanish, Chinese, and Arabic. So if you do have refugees that have already arrived in Canada that speak any one of those languages, or you're sponsoring refugees that speak any of those languages, you may want to direct them to this website, because there is information, there's myth-busting resources, there's fact sheets on COVID-19, how to prevent its spread, and there's also some videos for those refugees that may not be literate or may prefer a more visual communication style that you may be able to share with them. And the videos are in English, but they do have subtitles in all of those languages that I've mentioned. The other website we'd like to draw your attention to is the Public Health Agency of Canada's website. And again, there's a lot of information available on symptoms, treatment, prevention, how to quarantine and self-isolate, tips for maintaining physical distance. And there's also some very helpful fact sheets that are available in a number of different languages, as well as fact sheets on how to reduce the spread of COVID-19, how to wash hands, how to maintain physical distancing, and that can all be found on the Public Health Agency of Canada's website. If you click on the resources section and you just click on the resource that you're interested in, on the right over here there should be a toolbar that lets you pick which language you would like the resources in. The resources are being updated and are being made available in a number of different languages, so not all of them are available at the moment, but some of them, for example, are available in different languages, and you can use the drop-down box on the right there to select what language you would like. On the IRCC website, if you want more information or if you want to stay up to date on how COVID-19 is affecting refugee sponsorship applications, if you go to the IRCC homepage, you'll see a link here in yellow to their COVID-19 hub. And this is where you'll be able to get information on how COVID-19 is affecting all immigration applications to Canada. But if you click on the refugees, asylum claimants and sponsors page, you'll be able to find the latest information on how COVID-19 is affecting refugee sponsorship applications. And there's also the latest information on the travel restrictions and the exemption categories. So if you want more information about the travel restrictions, as well as some more detailed information about the other exemption categories, you can find them on the IRCC website. And then finally, there's the RSTP website. And on our homepage, we do have a link to our COVID-19 hub. And this is where we're posting updates from IRCC, as well as links to resources that we've produced or other organizations and agencies have produced that are available in various languages. And if you would like to get the latest information on submitting an application to ROCCO and how COVID-19 has affected ROCCO, there's some information on our website that's accessible via this hub. You can find links to the multi-language resources handout that you have available to download also through this hub. And there's also direct links to the Public Health Agency of Canada's website. If you'd like to find a copy of the recording on how to submit your PSR application to ROCCO via email, if you click on resources and then past webinars, if you scroll down, there will be this webinar here, how to submit a PSR application to ROCCO via email. Just click on that link, you'll be able to view a recording of a webinar that we did last year on how to prepare an application for email submission to ROCCO. because if you are submitting your application via email to Rocco, the application does need to be structured in a certain way, and you do need to make sure that the email as well as the attachments meet the size requirements of the Rocco email inbox. If you want to attend a live training of how to submit a PSR application by email, we do have one coming up on April 17th. We did do a brief session on how to submit an application via email in the previous update webinar that we did, but we're not doing one today just because it does take a lot of time, and I do know a lot of you do have questions that you have been sending in, and we'd like to address those questions. So we're having a separate webinar on how to submit an application to Rocco via email on Friday, April 17th, and the registration link can be found under the training and webinars tab. If you want to find the contact information of IRCC's collection services, if you click on resources, click on fact sheets, click on applying, there is a fact sheet on transportation loans, and it'll give you all of the information you need about transportation loans, including about the repayment period, when repayment is expected to begin, and right at the bottom it will have the phone number and email address of IRCC's collection services. So if the refugees that you sponsored that are in that repayment period have set up automatic pre-authorized payments, please let them know to contact IRCC's collection services to cancel those payments because transportation loan collections have been suspended for 6 months until September 2020. And then finally, if you would like to stay up to date, in addition to these webinars that we're doing every couple of weeks, we do send a lot of information out on our mailing list. So if you scroll down and click the subscribe button here, you'll be able to join our mailing list and you'll be up to date on all of the information on COVID-19 and how it's affecting refugee sponsorship and resettlement to Canada. You'll also find, or you'll also be up to date on the upcoming training sessions and online webinars that we have. Because although we are working from home, we are still available to speak to you, answer your questions, provide you with assistance, and all of our training will be shifting to virtual platforms and online platforms. And if you would like to contact your local RSTP trainer, please click on the Contact Us page, and you'll be able to find the contact details of the RSTP trainers across the country in Ontario, Halifax, Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. We are all working from home and we are still available to assist you, and you're welcome to contact your nearest RSTP trainer if you do have any questions about refugee sponsorship in general, as well as specific questions about applications that you may have submitted and are impacted by COVID-19. So that's everything for the webinar for today. I noticed there were a couple of questions coming in. So what I'm going to do is I am going to mute myself for a moment. I'm going to review those questions, and then I'll be back on air in a couple of minutes, and then we'll go through those questions. In the meantime, if you do have any questions that you would like to receive answers to, please do send them in using the question box or raise your hand, and I'll be able to unmute you and you can ask your question via microphone. So I'm just going to mute myself for a moment and I'll be back on there within a couple of minutes to go through the questions. Okay, so I'm just sorting through the questions now. If you just give me a couple more minutes and then we'll start going through them together. Thank you to everybody who let me know about the audio issues, and I'm glad we were able to fix those. So question on whether this webinar is being recorded. So yes, the webinar is being recorded, and hopefully the recording worked. Because last time we tried to record the webinar, there was an error with the system, and the webinar told us it was being recorded, but it did not actually record. So we're hoping that this webinar recorded, and if it is, we'll cut out the beginning part with all of the audio issues, so you don't have to hear that all again, and we'll make it available for viewing on our website and YouTube channel. Okay, so a couple of questions about whether sponsored refugees who are within their sponsorship period and were working but lost their job due to COVID-19, would they be eligible for the Canada Emergency Relief Benefit or employment insurance? So the answer is they would be eligible for employment insurance if they meet the eligibility requirements, and sponsored refugees can apply for employment insurance during their sponsorship period. And if they do apply for employment insurance during the sponsorship period, there'll be no consequences to the sponsors, because employment insurance is different to social assistance. If a sponsored refugee applies for social assistance during their 1-year sponsorship period, then the sponsors will be held in default and there will be consequences for the sponsors. But employment insurance is not considered to be social assistance, it's considered to be earned income. So if they do qualify for employment insurance, if they do meet the eligibility requirements, they can apply for employment insurance during the sponsorship period. In terms of whether they would qualify for the Canada Emergency Relief Benefit during the sponsorship period, we're still waiting for guidance from IRCC on this. They're currently in a process of drafting a Q&A document, and as soon as we receive any guidance or the document from IRCC on the Canada Emergency Relief Benefit and whether sponsored refugees within their sponsorship period are eligible to apply for it, we will share that guidance with you on our mailing lists, and we will most likely do an update webinar where you'll be able to join and receive that information via webinar. So in terms of employment insurance, yes, if they qualify, they can apply for it during the sponsorship period. In terms of the Canada Emergency Relief Benefit, the CERB, we don't know. We're still waiting for guidance from IRCC. Okay, so a question about an arrival. So one sponsor is asking, we were supposed to have an arrival on March 26th from Israel, but now his flight was cancelled. Do you know when he's coming? So unfortunately, we don't know when travel will resume again to Canada. The usual routes that are used, the usual travel routes that are used by the IOM to facilitate travel to Canada for sponsored refugees are down at the moment, and they're having issues with arranging travel. There's a limited availability of flights, and most of those routes are down at the moment. And the IOM and IRCC also has limited capacity to issue the documents that the refugees would need in order to come to Canada, in order to board a flight and to be admitted to Canada. So because of the issues with the travel routes and limited capacity to issue documents, we don't know when travel will resume. But if a sponsored refugee was in possession of a permanent resident visa before the travel restrictions came into effect on March 18th, 2020, IRCC will contact you, the sponsors, to let you know if and when they are able to facilitate travel to Canada. So even though they were scheduled to arrive in late March and their flight was cancelled, you will be contacted in the future if and when those travel routes reopen and IRCC and the IOM are able to begin facilitating travel to Canada. Okay, so another question about another travel question. The sponsor is asking, I got a notification of arrival transmission on March 16th, 2020, but I haven't got a cancellation for it yet. So everybody that did receive a NAT should be receiving a cancellation. And if you haven't received it yet, you should be receiving it shortly. But because all travel for from March 18th onwards has been going into April has been cancelled, it's most likely for whatever date the arrival was planned that arrival will not be happening until the travel routes reopen and until ISCC and the IOM has the capacity and the ability to facilitate travel and issue documents again. Okay, so a question regarding one-year window applications. The question is, can we submit them without signatures and get signatures at a later date? So yes, if you are submitting a one-year window application and you don't think you can get the forms signed before the one-year window deadline expires, submit them without signature to Rocco via email, and then they'll accept it, they'll put it to the side, and when you are able to get those forms signed, you just send them updated versions of the forms, and they'll begin processing the application once they receive everything. But do submit whatever you have for the one-year window application, just so you don't miss the one-year deadline. But again, as a reminder, this exemption only exists for one-year window applications. If you're submitting a regular private sponsorship application to Rocco, please make sure it's complete. Please make sure you have all of the necessary forms, signatures, and supporting documents before you submit the application, because if the application is incomplete, they will either return it to you or they will reject the application. The only current exemption that exists at the moment is in relation to one-year window applications. So yes, if it's a one-year window application, just submit what you have if you're having difficulties to get a complete application because of COVID-19, and they will accept it, put it to the side, and then when you're ready to submit everything that was missing, just send it to them, and then they'll start processing the application. Okay, so a couple more questions on the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. Do you know whether privately sponsored refugees are eligible yet? Unfortunately, we don't, but as soon as we get any information from ISCC, we will share it with you via our mailing list. But unfortunately, we don't know the answer yet, and we're still waiting for guidance from ISCC on this. Okay. So somebody would like me to show them where they can get the video, the recording of the video on how to submit the application via email. So I'm just going to exit out of this presentation. If you go to the RSDP website, once you select your language, English or French, you'll be taken to the home page. What you then do is if you click on resources and then you scroll down and go to past webinars, this is where you'll be able to find recordings of all the previous webinars that we've done. And if you scroll down, just over here, you'll see a recording titled How to Submit a PSR Application to Rocco by Email. If you click on that link, then you click on this and you'll be taken to our YouTube channel and you'll be able to review the recording. And like I said, we're also doing another live webinar on how to submit an application to Rocco by email on April 17th. And if you want to register for that webinar, if you click on training, webinars, and then you can find the details of all of our upcoming webinars in April, as well as the one on how to submit the PSR application to Rocco via email. Okay, so I'm just going through the questions. So another question's about recordings. Yes, so the recording will be available and we'll upload it to our website and YouTube channel once the recording has been edited. Some more questions about the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. Can somebody within their sponsorship period apply for it? we don't know at the moment, and as soon as we receive any information, we will let you know. A question on cap spaces for SARS. So the question is, has IRCC released its quota for SARS in 2020? And our understanding is that they're still finalizing the cap spaces and the global cap for 2020, and that will be announced, and SARS will be receiving their spaces shortly, their full allocation of spaces shortly. So a couple of people are asking for copies of the slides. So yes, if you email me after the webinar, I can share copies of the slides with you. And I'm just scrolling through. Okay, so questions about interviews. When will interviews be scheduled at migration offices overseas? And unfortunately, the answer is we don't know, but until migration offices overseas resume normal operations, because most of them closed down, others are only down to critical operations. They're only providing assistance to Canadian citizens and permanent residents that are overseas. Until they resume normal operations, they will most likely not be scheduling interviews. So unfortunately, again, the answer to a lot of these questions is we don't know, but as soon as we receive any information, we will share it with you. The question about the 1-year window, can you please expand on the application process? So yes, when it comes to the 1-year window, when the sponsoring group applies to sponsor the refugee, so at the time the application is submitted to the Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa, if some of the principal applicants' family members that meet IRCC's definition of a family are not able to travel with the principal applicant to Canada, or they would like to come to Canada at a later date and they don't want to travel with the principal applicant to Canada, they would indicate on the application forms, on both the generic application form for Canada and the sponsorship undertaking and settlement plan, that they are non-accompanying. If you look at both of those forms where you list the names of the principal applicant as well as the principal applicant's family members, you have to indicate whether each of those family members are either accompanying or non-accompanying. And you would indicate that they are accompanying if the family members would like to travel with the principal applicant to Canada. And that's regardless of where they're located, even if they're located in a different country to the principal applicant. If for whatever reason the principal applicant is not able to travel, if for whatever reason that the family member is not able to travel with the principal applicant to Canada, let's say they may be detained or they may be missing or presumed dead, or they do not want to travel with the principal applicant to Canada and they would like to come at a later date, you would indicate on the forms that they are non-accompanying. And then what happens is, if you indicate that they are accompanying, IRCC will process the application and ensure that the principal applicant and all accompanying family members travel to Canada together, even if they're located in different countries. If you indicate that some of the family members are non-accompanying, what will happen is that the principal applicant and any accompanying family members will travel to Canada. The non-accompanying family members will not travel with the principal applicant. What happens is the principal applicant has 1 year from their date of arrival in Canada to submit the 1-year window application to let the government of Canada know that they are now ready to bring their non-accompanying family member. So that's how the 1-year window application works. It's a separate application package that's submitted by the principal applicant. There's 3 forms that need to be completed, and it's a separate application package from the regular privately sponsored refugees application. And the application is only submitted, or the application is submitted by the principal applicant who's already in Canada, and there's a couple of forms that need to be completed by the principal applicant who is in Canada, as well as the non-accompanying family member that's coming under the 1-year window. And the principal applicant has 1 year from their date of arrival to submit that application to ROCO. But if at the moment, for whatever reason, they're not able to get a complete 1 year window application to ROCO within that 1 year deadline, just submit whatever they have, and they will have an opportunity to submit the other additional forms and documents to ROCO, because ROCO wants to make sure that they don't miss that 1 year deadline. Okay. So questions about when did ROCO stop processing mailed applications? So our understanding is that they stopped or they started working remotely rather in the week commencing March 16th. So if you submitted your application by mail in that week or after that week, then it's probably safe to assume that it's not going to be processed if you submitted via mail. If you submitted your application via mail a couple of months ago and you've already received a file number or a G number, that means that the application is in the system and they're able to process it. But if you're submitting a new application via mail, it will not be processed until normal operations resume, and they will process the mailed applications in the order that they received them. But if you submitted your application a couple of months ago and you've already received a file number, that means that the application is complete, it's in the system, and they are able to move that application forward because it's already been entered into the electronic system. Okay, so I'm just going through. So a couple of people are asking, how will you share any updates you receive from IRCC in regards to the Canada Emergency Response Benefit? So we will send that information out on our mailing list, and you can subscribe to our mailing list on our website. If you go to the homepage, scroll to the bottom, click on the subscribe button, enter your information and email address, and you'll be added automatically to our mailing list, and we'll be sending that information over our mailing list, and we'll also probably do an update webinar. And yes, we'll also post it on our website under the COVID-19 hub as well. Okay, so there's a question on what does the permanent resident visa look like? So from our understanding, the permanent resident visa consists of a single journey travel document that the refugee uses in lieu of a passport to travel to Canada as their travel document. And they're also issued a visa that's attached to that single journey travel document. And then they're also issued a confirmation of permanent residence document before they arrive in Canada that will then be authorized on arrival by the officer at the port of entry that meets them and processes their permanent resident card application. So in terms of what it looks like, they will have 3 documents. There'll be a single journey travel document that will be used in lieu of a passport. There will be a permanent resident visa that's attached to that travel document. And then they'll also have the confirmation of permanent residence document that is that will be authorized on arrival in Canada and will be processed by the CBSA officer that they meet at the port of entry, and that will process their PR card application. Okay, so a question about application processing. Do you think it's possible that IRCC will change requirements to allow us to file a sponsorship application without the applicant's signatures? Are there any discussions going on about this at IRCC? So we haven't received any information at the moment on whether they will accept applications without signatures. The only exemptions that have been made are for one-year window applications. And IRCC at the moment has not made any exemptions to the requirements for regular private sponsorship applications. But what is happening is we do have weekly update calls with officers and staff from IRCC, and that's when we get regular updates on measures that may be introduced or measures that have been introduced in the previous week. And a lot of the information that was contained in this webinar was obtained from those weekly update calls. So at the moment, there are no special exemptions in effect. If any special exemptions are introduced, we will let you know via our mailing list, as well as posting it on our website and in the next update webinar that we do. So a question on whether electronic signatures can be used on PSR applications. So that's a good question. And electronic signatures or digital signatures will not be accepted. The forms must be signed by hand. However, we do know that ROCA will accept scanned signatures. So if the refugee is able to print the form out, sign it, and either scan it or take a photo of the signature page and send it back to you, that will be okay. They will accept scanned copies of the signature pages on the forms, as well as from the sponsoring group. But digital signatures where somebody signs a form using their keyboard just by typing their name will not be accepted by ROCO at the moment. Okay, so there's a lot of questions about when visa offices will be scheduling interviews, and these are for applications that were sent by ROCO to the visa office overseas before the COVID-19 pandemic occurred. And again, unfortunately, the answer is we don't know, because IRCC's operations have been severely affected by COVID-19, and visa offices, migration offices have closed. Others are just down to critical operations only, where they're only providing assistance to Canadian citizens and permanent residents overseas. So we don't know when they will begin normal operations, but because their capacity has been reduced drastically, you can safely assume that there will be processing delays at all stages of the application process, both in Canada at the Resettlement Operations Centre in Ottawa, as well as overseas at the migration offices, because at the moment they're not scheduling any interviews, they're not moving applications forward, they're not doing any medical examinations. So COVID-19 has had a significant impact on the application process, both in Canada and overseas. And we don't have any specific information on when IRCC will begin normal processing operations again, both in Canada and at visa offices overseas. So questions on how to be added to the mailing list. So just on your screen now, if you go to the homepage, click on subscribe, then you will be able to add your email address to our mailing list. Okay, so will mailed sponsorship applications still be accepted, or are they only accepting emailed applications? So you can still submit your application via mail if you would like to, but it will not be processed until the Resettlement Operations Centre in Ottawa resumes its regular processing. And like I said, we don't know when that's going to happen. So if you are submitting a new sponsorship application to ROCO and you would like to have it processed, please do so via email, because if you do via mail, it will most likely not be processed for some time until ROCO resumes regular operations. Obviously, when they do reopen and they do resume regular operations, they will process the mailed applications in the order that they received them in. But if you would like to have your application processed, please make sure you do submit it via email. Okay, so there's a question about visitor visas. What is the likelihood of a visitor visa being granted after it's been denied the first time? And unfortunately, we're not able to provide any advice or information or guidance on other immigration streams. We're only able to provide information, advice, training, and support on anything related to refugee sponsorship. If you're looking for advice or information on other immigration streams, such as the visitor visa scheme or family class sponsorship or skilled workers class, you would need to speak to an immigration lawyer or an immigration consultant. So there's a question, sorry, just want to confirm a scan of the signature page is okay. Yes, so if the refugees are able to, or your sponsors are able to print the form, sign it, and scan it, then that will be accepted by Rocco. So question on the confirmation of permanent residence document. So aren't confirmation of PR forms normally issued on arrival? So they're actually given to the refugees before they arrive in Canada, and it's actually one of the 3 documents that they're given before the refugees travel to Canada. So they'll be given their single journey travel document that they'll use in lieu of a passport. They'll have their visa attached to their single journey travel document, and they'll also have a copy of the confirmation of permanent residence document, which is then validated on arrival, and that validation basically means that that's when they do become a permanent resident. Okay, so question on which groups can apply for transportation loans. Can you apply for transportation loans if you are sponsoring with the assistance of a SAR? So all sponsored refugees coming to Canada, regardless of whether they're sponsored under the private sponsorship program, under the blended visa office referred program, or under the government assisted refugees program or the joint assistance sponsorship program, and regardless of whether they're submitted or sponsored by a group of 5, a community sponsor, or a sponsorship agreement holder, they will receive a transportation loan. So all sponsored refugees coming to Canada will receive a transportation loan from the government of Canada that will cover the cost of their travel to Canada. And there's no need for the sponsored refugees or the sponsoring group to apply for that loan. It's issued as part of the regular processing procedures. Okay, so there's still some more questions about interviews and when they'll be scheduled. And like I said, unfortunately, we don't know. There will most likely be a delay to interviews being scheduled, medical examinations being scheduled overseas, and for sure there'll be delays to documents being issued and travel being arranged, just because of the reduced capacity, the limited resources that ISCC has at the moment, the offices that have closed, and the limited travel routes and flights that are available to Canada. Okay, so a question on a group of 5 sponsorship. Will Rocco accept a group of 5 sponsorship that uses notices of assessment issued, uses the 2018 versions of the notice of assessment, given that the 2019 version may not be available to some people because they have not filed their tax return? So the information that we have from Rocco is for sponsors to submit whichever year's tax documents that they have available. So normally they request copies of the most recent tax year, but if for whatever reason sponsors haven't filed their taxes for the most recent tax year and they don't have their 2019 notice of assessment, they can use the 2018 version, but everybody that's employed should have been issued a T4 already, because the deadline for issuing 2019 versions of the T4 was the end of February for employers. So you can use either the notice of assessment or the T4. So if members of your sponsoring group are employed, they should have a 2019 version of a T4. And you can use that because ROCO does accept notices of assessment and T4s as proof of income for Group of 5 applications. If, for whatever reason, somebody doesn't have a 2019 T4, then you can go ahead with a 2018 notice of assessment, but include a cover letter explaining why that individual is including a copy of their 2018 notice of assessment and why they don't have a copy of their 2019 T4 or why they don't have a copy of their 2019 notice of assessment. Okay, so there's more questions about travel. So a couple of you did receive cancellation emails for travel that was arranged or scheduled to occur after March 18th, 2020, when the travel restrictions came into an effect. And you're asking when will they arrive in Canada? And at the moment, the answer is we don't know. When flights and routes become available, IRCC will contact sponsors that are sponsoring refugees who are in possession of a permanent residence visa, and they will confirm your availability and your ability to welcome the newcomers to Canada on arrival, as well as ensuring that they do have suitable accommodation to self-quarantine for 14 days. And they'll also contact the refugees to ensure that they are happy with traveling to Canada, and also that your group has the capacity and the ability to provide financial and settlement support to the newcomers on arrival. So a question on processing overseas. If refugees were asked to submit documents to migration offices overseas, how will that work now? So typically when you receive a request for documents or additional forms from a visa office overseas or a migration office overseas, that request comes in the form of an email, and the refugees are requested to submit copies of those documents and forms via email to the migration office. So if a refugee or a refugee family has received a request for additional documentation or additional forms from the migration office, they should still respond to that email within the allotted time frame. Typically, they're given 30 days to respond with copies of whatever documents that they are able to obtain or whatever forms they are able to complete. If for whatever reason, due to COVID-19, they're not able to meet those deadlines, they should contact the migration office by email just to let them know that they're not able to meet the deadlines or they're not able to submit copies of certain forms or certain documents. But it's very important that they inform the migration office before the 30-day deadline expires, and they submit whatever they are able to submit before that deadline expires. Okay, so there's a question from somebody overseas who is asking, an application was submitted by my sponsoring group in Canada. They submitted the application to IRCC in December 2019. What's going to happen to the application as a result of COVID-19? So if the application was submitted by your sponsoring group in December 2019 and there was nothing wrong with the application, it should have already been assigned a file number and it should have been entered into the electronic system. And you would have been copied on any email communication sent to your sponsoring group in relation to whether a file number was issued or whether there was something wrong with the application and it was being returned to the sponsoring group. But please ask your sponsoring group in BC to contact us. We do have a team in BC that is able to assist them, and they'll be able to speak to them, get some more information, and advise them accordingly and share the relevant information. So please get your sponsoring group to contact my colleagues in BC, and we'll be able to provide them with some additional information. Okay, so there is a question from a sponsor who said that they received a pre-return because the ROCO officer did not see a cover letter that explained why an email address was missing or why the co-sponsor's email address was used for the PA, for the principal applicant. And the sponsor replied to the letter, but they have not heard back from ROCO. So the only way to contact ROCO is via email, and you can find the email address for ROCO in the Key in Canada contacts handout that's available to download. But unfortunately, there is no way to call them or communicate with them in any other way. Email is the only way to get in touch with the Resettlement Operations Centre in Ottawa. So you would need to send them an email. Obviously, because they are working remotely, it may take them some time to get back to you because they're probably receiving a lot of applications via email, as well as questions about applications that are already in process from sponsors, as well as refugees, about what's happening in light of COVID-19. So please do send them an email. They should get back to you. But because of COVID-19, and because they are working remotely, it may take them some time to respond to your email. Okay, so some more questions about travel that was scheduled post March 18th, 2020, when the travel restrictions came into effect. And those of you that have received cancellation notices for those travel arrangements are asking when those travel arrangements will be rebooked. IRCC will contact you when flights and travel routes become available, and they will contact both you and the sponsor and the refugees that you're sponsoring to confirm that you're able to receive the refugees, ensure that they're able to self-quarantine for 14 days, provide financial and settlement support to them, as well as confirming that the refugees would like to travel to Canada. But unfortunately, we don't have any more information. We do have an update call with IRCC coming up this Thursday. We may receive some more information then. But to date, the only information we have is IRCC will contact you if and when they're able to facilitate travel to Canada. So somebody's asking, how can they access our YouTube channel? The easiest way is if you go to our website, which you can see on screen. You can see right at the top here, we have links to our YouTube channel and our social media channels. So if you just click on the YouTube icon, you'll be taken to our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to find copies of the recordings that are also available on the past webinars page. Okay, so somebody is asking for my contact information so they can get a copy of the presentation. So my contact details are on screen. You're welcome to send me an email or give me a call if you have any questions. So questions on what are UNHCR's and the IOM's plans and when will they resume normal operations? We don't know at the moment. And I know a lot of the answers to the questions today are we don't know. The reasons for that is it's a very fast-moving and evolving situation, and we are trying to get information out to everybody as soon as we receive it, either through our website, our mailing list, or through doing webinars. But we will let you know as soon as we receive any new information related to application processing. Please do sign up for our mailing list and keep an eye out on our website, on our COVID-19 hub. Okay, so a couple of you are just commenting on the audio issues, and again, I do apologize for the audio issues at the beginning. We do normally do a test before we start the webinar. When I did the test, everything was working fine. I started the webinar and everything was working fine, but for whatever reason, we had audio issues at the beginning. So again, I do apologize. And in the recording, we will edit out the 5 minutes or so at the beginning where I was trying to figure out what was going on with the audio, but I do apologize for the audio issues. Again, there's a lot of questions about the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and unfortunately, we don't have an answer. We're waiting for guidance at the moment. So there's a question, somebody's asking, why are attendees not able to see the questions that are being asked by participants? The way GoToWebinar is set up is only the organizers are able to see the questions coming in. We can look to see whether there's a way to change those settings in future webinars, but based on my understanding of GoToWebinar, it's only the organizers or the panelists or the co-organizers that are able to see the questions coming in. So questions about if you're working with a SAR, are they able to submit applications? So the answer is yes, some SARs were advanced spaces. Not all SARs were advanced spaces, so you do need to check with the SAR that you're working with whether they were advanced spaces. But the overall global allocation to SARs has not been issued by the government yet. So most SARs are still waiting to receive their spaces for 2020. Those that were advanced spaces have been submitting applications, and they have been submitting those applications via email in order to ensure that they're processed. Okay, so another question, who do we contact for an application status? So if you want to get an update on the status of your application, you would need to contact the Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa, and they will be able to verify the status of the application, but you would need to include the name of the principal applicant, the date of birth, and the file number in the email in order for them to conduct the verification and give you an update. But because they are working remotely at the moment, it may take them some time to get back to you, just because they're working remotely and they're dealing with a large amount of traffic into their email inbox at the moment. Question on refused applications. Is it possible to request a reconsideration of a group of 5 application that has been refused? So the answer is yes, you can request a reconsideration if an application has been refused, either by the Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa or the Canadian Visa Office overseas. So you can ask for a reconsideration, and in order to ask for a reconsideration, what you would need to do is you would need to contact the office that made the decision. So if the application was rejected in Canada at the Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa, you would contact them via email, and you would explain, obviously you would need to include the name of the principal applicant, date of birth, and the file number in the subject line, and you need to explain in the body of the email why you're requesting a reconsideration. And then it's up to the discretion of the officer that reviews that request at ROCO as to whether they will reopen the case for reconsideration. If the decision was made by the visa office overseas, then you would contact the visa office overseas via email in order to request a reconsideration. The important thing when it comes to reconsideration requests is if you're submitting new information or new documents or new forms that was not available to the officer when they made the decision, they will not consider those new documents, the new forms, or the new information. They will only reconsider their decision on the basis of the documents and information that they have on file. So if you would like to request a reconsideration and you're submitting new forms, new documents, new information, the best thing to do is not submit that reconsideration request, just submit a new application package to ROCO, because that's what they'll ask you to do anyway if you are submitting new information, new forms, or new documents. You're only able to request a reconsideration request on the basis of the information, documents, and forms that the officer had available to them at the time they made the decision. Okay, so questions on, so there's a question on a refugee doesn't have access to the internet, so how will they receive updates of their travel plans to come to Canada? So the majority of the communication with sponsored refugees and sponsors is done via email. And typically the same email is sent to both sponsors and the refugees overseas at the same time. So all the members of the sponsoring group, all the parties to the sponsorship, if you're working with a sponsorship agreement holder, and the refugees that are being sponsored will be copied on the communication. And that's the primary way the Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa, as well as the Migration Office overseas, communicates with sponsored refugees that have applications in process. If somebody does not have access to the internet and access to an email account, try getting in touch with the Migration Office overseas and letting them know that the best way to communicate with this refugee is via telephone. If not, please try and get somebody in Canada, maybe one of the sponsoring group, to monitor the refugee's email address, just so that they can see any communication that comes in from IRCC, and that they're then able to communicate, the sponsor is then able to communicate with the refugee over the phone or via WhatsApp or however they're contactable in order to confirm information with them. But ideally, they would need to have access to the internet and the email address that was listed on the application forms, because that's the primary way the visa office and the Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa communicates with sponsored refugees as well as the members of the sponsoring group. Okay, so there's the last couple of questions. I'm going to go through these ones because I do recognize we are over time and I don't want to keep you here. So there's a question on self-booking of travel. If somebody has their permanent resident visa, can they come to Canada without a transportation loan if the sponsors pay for their travel, assuming it's possible to access an airline and a travel route? So IRCC does not encourage refugees to self-book travel or sponsors to book travel for the refugees at the moment, regardless of whether they do have a permanent residence visa in hand. The reason for that is if something happens en route, if there's an issue with the travel plans, if there's an issue transiting through a country, or even if there's issues transiting within the country the refugee is located in, the International Organization for Migration will not be able to assist because they do have a reduced capacity at the moment. The other thing to consider is most countries refugees are located in, they need an exit permit to leave the country. And normally it's the International Organization for Migration that facilitates the application process for that exit permit. And normally it's the International Organization for Migration that issues the single-use travel document that the refugees will use in lieu of a passport to come to Canada. So even though theoretically it may be possible if you're able to get access to an airline and a travel route to come to Canada, practically speaking, it's not advised just because there's a number of hurdles in the process. They may not be able to get the exit permits they need to exit the country. They may not be able to get their single-use travel document. They may not be able to leave the country if things change, because things are evolving and changing very quickly in terms of how countries and organizations are responding to COVID-19 to stop its spread. And for all of those reasons, that's why IRCC is not recommending that refugees self-book travel or sponsors book travel for the refugees. IRCC are working very hard to try and figure out alternative routes and try and get refugees
to Canada that do have permanent resident visas. And while I know it can be difficult for the refugees, the best thing for them to do is to just wait until IRCC is able to contact them and to confirm that they are able to travel to Canada, and for the IOM to make the travel arrangements, just to ensure that there's no other complications and refugees aren't stuck in transit to Canada because they self-book travel and they're not able to leave the country, or they're not able to get the assistance of the IOM. Okay, so a question about non-accompanying family member that arrives in Canada after the principal applicant's sponsorship period has come to an end. So that's a good question, but it's also a very complicated answer, because in terms of what is expected of the sponsoring group, they're still expected to provide settlement support to the non-accompanying family member for 1 year after the date of arrival, even though the principal applicant's sponsorship period has come to an end. They may not be providing settlement support to the principal applicant, but they still have to provide it to the non-accompanying family member that arrives under the 1 year window for 1 year after the date of their arrival. When it comes to financial support, it depends on the circumstances of the principal applicant already in Canada. And there's different procedures that need to be followed depending on whether the principal applicant is employed and has their own source of income, whether the principal applicant is receiving social assistance because they're not employed or self-employed, or if the non-accompanying family member arrives within the sponsorship period of the principal applicant, there's also procedures that need to be followed. So there's different scenarios depending on when the non-accompanying family member arrives and what the situation of the principal applicant is at the time of arrival. But if you want specific guidance and you want to go through those 3 scenarios, what I encourage you to do is, if you go to the FAQs on post-arrival financial support that is accessible under the FAQs tab, I believe it's question 12, you'll be able to get the information as well as a link to IRCC's guidelines on what needs to be followed. And as you can see here, there's those 3 different scenarios. So the principal applicant is receiving financial support from the sponsors because they're still in their sponsorship period. Principal applicant is receiving provincial social assistance, or the principal applicant is employed, and it outlines what needs to be done for those 3 scenarios here. But it's a very good question. Unfortunately, it's a very complicated answer. And if you would like to discuss this further, please contact me after the webinar. I'll be happy to speak to you about this further. Okay, so final 2 questions. If a sponsor has concerns about providing financial support to a refugee that's in their sponsorship period as a result of COVID-19, can they defer paying the monthly income support to the sponsored refugee? In that scenario, if a sponsor has concerns about being able to provide financial or settlement support as a result of COVID-19 for a refugee that's already arrived in Canada, I would strongly recommend they contact the Resettlement Services Assurance Team. The email address for that team is on screen. Because like I said, we are waiting for guidance from IRCC on a number of post-arrival issues in COVID-19. But if somebody has concerns now and they need an immediate response, please contact the Resettlement Services Assurance Team, and they would be able to provide specific guidance. Okay, final question before we end today. So this is actually an application question. So if you're preparing a group of 5 application, is the formula that's outlined within the IMM 2200 guide on determining whether a group of 5 sponsors have sufficient income to sponsor, is that formula used when funds are held in trust? So that formula, where they'll do the income assessment using the formula in the guide, that that assessment is only done and that formula is only used when sponsors are pledging from their personal income. So if you remember, a group of 5 has 3 options to demonstrate to Rocco at the time they submit the application that they have the necessary financial capacity. The first is to put funds held in trust. The second is to have at least 3 sponsors pledge from their personal income. And the third is to do a mix of the first 2 options. If the funds are held in trust, you need to include evidence of where the money came from. You need to include an explanation as to where the money came from on the forms. And if anybody within the sponsoring group contributed to the funds held in trust, they would need to complete the financial profile form and provide proof of income in the form of a copy of their most recent T4 or notice of assessment. But they won't do the income assessment. So even though you're providing copies of your T4 notice of assessment, if members of the group contributed to the funds held in trust, they won't do the income assessment if the entire amount is held in trust after in-kind deductions. It's only if sponsors take the second option, where there's no funds held in trust, and at least 3 sponsors are pledging from their personal income, they'll do that income assessment that you see in the IMM 2200 guide. So there's a follow-up question, but in reality, Rocco is also requesting for a T4 even when a trust fund is created. So yeah, so if there is a trust fund, as I mentioned, or there's funds held in trust, and members from within the group of 5 are contributing to the funds held in trust. So the money held in trust is coming from the group of 5 members. Those group of 5 members that are contributing to the funds held in trust are expected to provide a copy of their most recent T4 or notice of assessment. It's not an inconsistency. If you look at the IMM 2200 guide, it does specify in there that if the funds held in trust are coming from group members, they must include a copy of their most recent T4 or notice of assessment, as well as complete the financial profile form. Okay, final question, and then we'll end. Refugees outside Canada, we are supporting them financially. Can we apply for the emergency support? So I assume you mean, can the sponsors in that case that are waiting for the refugee to arrive in Canada, can they apply for the Canada Emergency Relief Benefit? And the answer is yes. If the sponsors meet the eligibility requirements, they would be able to apply for the Canada Emergency Relief Benefit. If you go to our website, recently we've updated our COVID-19 hub, where we have a fact sheet that's available in a number of different languages that provides a summary of the financial benefits available under Canada's COVID-19 Economic Response Plan. So your sponsors can review that to see if you're eligible. But like I said, in terms of whether the sponsored refugees are eligible, if they're within their sponsorship period and they lost their job because of COVID-19, we're still waiting for guidance from IRCC on that, and we will share that information with you as soon as we receive it. So those are all of the questions for today. Thank you all for joining, and thank you for all of the questions that came in. There were a lot of good questions. Hopefully this webinar was helpful. And like I said, we will be doing an update webinar most likely in a couple of weeks. Once we do have some new information from IRCC, we're having weekly calls with them. And as soon as we receive any information on application processing or any updates or any information on the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, we will definitely let you know either via a webinar, but we will most certainly send out that information on our mailing list, as well as post it on our COVID-19 hub on our website. So thank you once again for joining, and apologies once again for the audio issues. The recording will hopefully go up soon, and we'll make sure those audio issues at the beginning are cut out. So if you weren't able to hear me at the beginning, hopefully you'll be able to review the recording if there's no glitches or errors with the GoToWebinar recording system. So thank you once again for joining, and I hope everyone has a good afternoon.